Good morning, everyone. So glad to see many of you are here already today, and so glad you've joined us for what will hopefully be a rousing and useful conversation about executive communications. I love a timely start, so let's get started. So many of us who support C-level executives and their communications for a living, like I do and my colleagues do here, probably went into 2020 with a fairly good idea of what we wanted to achieve. And we probably had a fairly good idea of what topics we wanted our executives to engage in, and with a fairly good idea of how we would ideally help position those executives to benefit our companies. That's what we do. And then this happened. Then it was 2020. And I don't know about you, but it was just one massive crisis after another, wasn't it? All these lovely narratives we'd crafted around maybe sustainability or transformation or scale. Well, those went straight out the window and in favor of a new or at least exceptionally urgent issue and new narrative that we needed to develop. COVID, Black Lives Matter, democracy itself was on the table last year. And I don't think maybe many of us planned for those topics when we did our exec comms planning last year. So what happened was, with these major issues of public importance, there was this incredibly divided leadership at the government level where clear answers and direction were hard to find. And corporate executives were then thrust into a position where, number one, they had to be on tap to reassure employees, stakeholders, customers, maybe even partners. They had to give clear guidance on these matters of incredible urgency and public importance. And they had to live with the consequences of their guidance and action, as they usually do, or with the consequences of their inaction. This was a new paradigm for executive communications, and I think we're all living with that now, and the results of that now. So executive comms has changed for good, and that's our view at Hotwire. If you've thought about the plans that you made last year, you probably imagined that there would be different results. Profile stories of your execs, speaking about your business directly to tech and business reporters, and instead, the conversation really shifted, especially in the media and what the media wanted to cover. Early in 2020, the human condition our executives were most likely to be concerned about and most likely to be asked about in the media involved retention of employees, right? That was a safe and relevant lens to view and talk about employees through. What can I do from an organizational and leadership level to keep my employees working here? But the first two crises of the year, the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, quickly pushed executives to re-examine their relationship to employees as a whole. They were now responsible for their safety at home and at work. They needed to communicate that they cared about employees first. And as TechCrunch called it, a new kind of CEO emerged, a human-centric CEO that trumps this, what I feel is getting grosser by the minute adage of a wartime CEO. So there used to be this idea of peacetime versus wartime CEO, and that didn't feel appropriate anymore in the crises that we were dealing with. You'll see that CEOs were concerned with the same kind of general trends that they had been at the beginning of 2020, cybersecurity, talent, upskilling, and now they were united in concern around the global pandemic being their number one issue, and the ongoing fallout to businesses and the economy and to their own employees. And then, and so that really shifted the conversation in the media. And then we also saw, if you look at the headlines in the bottom, in early 2020, there were very few examples, and man, this has changed a lot, of CEOs ever weighing into politics. Communication professionals like myself, like Sarah Calhorn, who I'm here with today, like Charlene Gage, we generally have encouraged executives to avoid getting political, lest they isolate massive bases of customers, right, or stakeholders who find themselves politically opposed. 10 short months later, CEOs are being hailed as the fourth branch of government. That is a huge change in the responsibility of CEOs in what they need to communicate. It's changed everything. And if we think about that and the implications of that in terms of trust and transparency and accountability and everything we're going to need to communicate, now that we hold this new responsibility in supporting our executives, we have to really rethink how we plan their communications, how we support their communications, and how we show up to a broad base of people that have a increasing expectations of what our executives are going to say and how they're going to show up in the world.
And this all means that we cannot keep doing the same things. We've got to change how we approach executive communications. And it's not just these anecdotes and these headlines that all of us who are in communications see every day. There's a lot of data, and there's continually more data that clearly shows that really important audiences have new expectations on what executives will say, how they will say it, and how they will be held to account for it. The majority of customers, 7 in 10 consumers, want and expect brands, CEOs to step in and fix issues that the government cannot solve. The issues we're talking about this year are issues that cannot be solved by the government alone, even if we did have a super functional leadership at that level. These are issues that require public and private partnership. They require people who are at the ground level, who are involved in communities to take action and make change. And that is a new expectation, and it is continuing to grow. And we're not just talking about consumer companies. This doesn't only matter to those that sell to everyone across America. This matters to business decision makers. This is our own research, and I'm sure the numbers have gone up because this is a year old now. 86% of business buyers take values into account when they are making purchasing decisions. That's enormous. And beyond that, 80% said they would terminate a supplier relationship based on a failure to address a high stakes issue in a way that aligns to the values of that company and the vendor, what they've communicated. So those are huge bottom line impacting reactions to what executive comms is doing and how we are living and showing up with our values. And I really also want to call out here, one of the biggest issues is how your employees are reacting, or how potential employees are reacting. After the murder of George Floyd, there was a survey done across Black employees in tech specifically. And as tech companies were some of the first to step in and say something and really give a voice there, as they traditionally have sort of led the way in some of these societal issues. Only 4% of Black employees thought their company responded well. Ugh. Woof, that is horrifying. I do think that, that was an issue where a lot of people learned a lot, and a lot of people have changed and evolved how they've responded. I hope that number has gone up, but that's a number that everyone should note and take concern about. Almost all these companies are driven by the human intelligence that is within them. And if you are not attracting people, especially now, as everyone is looking to really make huge strides in diversifying their workforce, if that's the level we are starting at, we have a long, long way to go. But who the heck are we, and why should you be listening to us anyway? Hotwire is a tech communications consultancy. We are global. We deal with this across borders, and this is what we do every day. I am Sarah Calhorn. I'm a vice president, and I run our Minneapolis office. My focus is on industrial technology. These are the C-suiters that are often the last or least eager to enter the fray. A lot of them are engineers. But this has changed. This is impacting the companies and the C-suites that I work with. And when those folks start taking a stand and going big externally, you really know that the change is real.
Hi, I'm Charlene Gage. I'm a media strategy manager based out of our San Francisco office. And so I'm all in when it comes to media. I'm speaking with reporters regularly, speaking with them about the trends and topics that they're covering, dissecting what they're writing about to see what are the kind of questions that they're asking, how are they covering, what the angle they're using to cover certain topics, and then seeing and tracking new publications, reporter moves that might have some type of impact for our clients, and bringing all those insights back to our executives to help pair the right executive with the stories that they want to tell, and marry that with the right audience and the right reporter to have the most significant business objective impact for their bottom line, and can make those connections and help tell the story the best way that can be done.
Thanks, Charlene. And I'm Lindsay Rydell. I lead our corporate and executive communications practice here at Hotwire. I work with C-level executives every day to help coach them and help develop the narratives that are going to most align to their values, work best to tell a story that's compelling and memorable in the media. And as a former journalist of 18 years, I've been fascinated over the past year by how the media has shifted its coverage, its tone, its urgency, and who it looks to for information and action in the kind of unprecedented year that we've all been through. So what are we going to talk about today? We're glad that you have all joined us. We're going to talk about the changing role of the media and our executive spokespeople. So how's the media changed and what are the new requirements on our executives? We're going to talk about the 3 A's of post-2020 leadership that are going to be critical to your executive communication strategy. And no, I'm not going to tell you what they are now, because then why would you stay and hang out with us for the rest of the hour? And then finally, we're going to talk about how to better prepare your C-suite in 2021 for an exec comm strategy that can anticipate, adapt, and position your executives in the best possible way, no matter what kind of gets thrown our way this year. So let's get to it.
So first we got to set the scene. We got to talk about what's changed for the media. And there has been dramatic change in the last year. How reporters are getting news has shifted. They, like the rest of us, have gone through this year of pandemic and have had to pivot. There have been a lot of layoffs with the initial downturn in marketing and ad spend at the beginning of the pandemic. A lot of outlets cut staff. These newsrooms were already, declining from where they had been. People were writing more furiously, more quickly. And what it meant for those folks is they had even more on their plates, more urgent news to report, and they had to figure out new ways to find sources, new ways of researching from their living rooms, like the rest of us in that transition. So no more big events to go and talk to several sources at once and get all that information. No more standing, close shoulder to shoulder with their sources. They really started to look at company communications a lot more closely. They looked at blogs, they looked at social media channels, both of executives of companies and of employees that worked there. They started doing a lot more send me on social media to try to get sources to proactively reach out to them. And at the same time, a lot of these reporters are having to report on entirely new things. We had a golf reporter reach out on a supply chain story. There was no golf happening, and there was so much happening in supply chains and toilet paper and now vaccines. So everyone is starting to cover all these new things. Newsrooms themselves are responding to George Floyd and trying to increase their coverage. And increase the representation in the newsrooms. So there's a lot of DE&I efforts going on internally, and a lot of that is new for some of the reporters that are tracking it and covering it. So there's just been a ton of disruption on the media side and how they work and how they get news made. At the same time, there's been clear disruption on the stories that are making news today. For editors and reporters, come March, there was one story. All of us who are in work every day in communications, we're probably doing the same thing, which is advising our clients that if you do not have helpful information to share regarding the pandemic or the economic devastation that is falling out of it, hold back. Be helpful, be a source of information to that news story, or fade back for a bit. And then we slowly did start to see trade media come back and start to cover things. They were also looking at the pandemic and the impact and the business impact and transition to cloud and all of those stories. But for the most part, we really had one big story. And just as we told all our clients that, another huge story came up, and we had these 2 pillars that were driving all news coverage, with the biggest civil rights movement since the civil rights movement. So those 2 things were really what needed to be covered. And again, as I said, there was a lot of education to be done of the general public. All of us in the United States were looking for answers, and the reporters were tasked with providing them and finding the sources to do that. So you've got disruption for reporters, you've got disruption for the world. And what that meant is that the way that news is getting covered and the sources that are coming in pulled executives in a new way. We saw Goodyear get dragged into this issue. Goodyear's a tire maker in Akron, Ohio. Someone at one of their facilities, an HR person, was trying to give recommendations to the people working in that facility of what was appropriate clothing to wear. And on that, it said no MAGA hats. Someone in the audience took a photo. It went all over the internet. It went all over the news. Trump saw it. He called for a boycott of Goodyear. All sorts of other people came on to Goodyear's offense, including LeBron James stood up and said, we must support Goodyear. They keep Akron going. It's American-made company, American-made products. It's so good. They eventually did. The executives eventually did come out with a corporate strategy, but it just got worse. They weren't ready. They tried to say you cannot have political, you cannot wear political clothing, but you can wear issues-based clothing like Black Lives Matter. At some point, it was confused as to whether or not you could wear Blue Lives Matter stuff, and Goodyear supplies tires to police departments. It was just fraught as all get out. And because they weren't ready for it, and because they were so slow to come out, and you know, first of all, ideally you're ahead of that game, and it's someone from corporate communications understands what's happening at these facilities. So you have a consistent policy across those. And then if you do get pulled into it, you have a strategy that you can stick with from the beginning, whereas they had to backtrack and shift a couple times. And it's a minefield. And you saw, you know, we saw just this month with the riots on Capitol Hill, we saw CEOs who were ready, who jumped in and were able to quickly denounce the riot and then also follow up with the action they were taking internally with any employees that were actually at the riot. So it's a minefield, but it's also increasingly expected that CEOs and other C-suiters will enter it, and they really need to be prepared. If your stakeholders are demanding that of you, if it's your employees or your customers or your investors or your board, if they are asking you to stand up, you need to be ready to do that and make sure you're prepared to do it. And if you do it well, it can be a huge platform for influencing very meaningful issues. But the change is it's now demanded, and it's not something that every single business can get into every time. And that's where the 3 A's are going to come into huge importance.
And building off what Sarah said, while in certain instances, and if you're prepared, there could be some level of opportunity. It is very much an expectation of the job for these C-suite executives to address these trends and issues going on within the media in the world that's facing employees, customers, partners, everyone. And even if the media isn't busting down the door asking for comments, you still have that audience waiting for a response, whether they are employees, customers, or even board of executives. In the article you've seen Bloomberg published about mid last year, Silence No More on Race, America's CEOs Fumble for the Right Word. It's known this is a new arena for executives, right? With problems and issues that CEOs had the opportunity to speak on before, there was this area of being able to have kind of that nice little happy medium of everyone knows there's no partisan issue on one side or another. Everyone knows COVID, this virus is bad. We don't like that. We have issues of terrorism is bad. We don't need to address that. But as this article notes, executives are being confronted with new topics like white privilege, like this heavy bipartisan politics, and even beyond that. So there's no medium when it comes to here. And it's a fast learning curve with an audience that's keeping track and keeping tallies of where executives and businesses are doing it right and where there's a fumble. And they're watching and tracking and comparing notes over time to see what the progress has been. It's something we've seen last year, especially around Black Lives Matter. Journalist Cheryl Dorsey, founder of The Plug, also contributes to other publications like USA Today, created a list with fellow reporters tracking companies' responses to Black Lives Matter movement. What did they say? What's the employee count? What's their diversity numbers? What's their revenue? What's their track record when it comes to diversity issues? Have they actually spoken out before? Have they not? And while this isn't something that is still being broadcasted and is a grid that you're able to click into and see now, it's still something that we can expect that's still being updated and watched today. We've seen it this last couple of weeks as well with the Capitol riots, as reporters immediately dived in looking for internal memos from CEOs. What is the company's stance? What's their response? dissecting exactly what they said. Are they for it? Are they against it? What's their perspective? Are they more neutral? And so what that means is we're seeing a pattern, and it means that it's going to become more regular and something that can be expected going forward. And that means communications for all people have to be foolproof. So that way, like Goodyear and when issues arise, you're not just thrust into the spotlight unexpectedly and lose control as well of the story and the narrative of your business. And that's where the 3 A's come in. We've gone and we've watched all these different CEO comments and perspective and stances, internal memos, external statements, dissected really what has been the cream of the crop, cutting above the rest, the best positioning for that business, and the most authentic. I'm going to get into the A's, the most authentic kind of responses there. And we've come up with more of these 3 A's of resilient leadership: authenticity, action, and accountability. And these are the A's you'd be considering as you think, how do I address these issues? How do I make sure that when I put my CEO out there to speak on these issues, or when he gets a question in a briefing about any of these topics, that I know he's not about to flub some type of words or get ripped to shreds. And it's asking questions like these. Is your answer going to be authentic to your business and mapping to your values? Are you ready to actually put action behind your words? And are you ready to be held accountable for what you're about to say? So I said 3 A's, but it's not done. We'll have a lot more to go. We have a lot of examples to talk through of what each of these look like in action. The great highlights we loved watching and reading through the year, the areas of opportunity to learn as well, and what this looks like in execution when it comes to your exec comms plan. So I'm going to pass it over to Lindsay, who talk us through the first one.
Thanks, Charlene. So I get to talk about authenticity, and it's absolutely critical when it comes to executive comms in 2021. I'd argue it was probably critical before, but we've never been challenged so much in kind of proving out how important authenticity was until the last year. What your executives value and their personal connection to and experiences with the urgent issues really does matter. It matters in how we tell the story and how we communicate in a way that people will feel good about and buy into and believe ultimately. And that just has a lot of repercussions for our brands and the trust that we're instilling with our brands. So when COVID struck, there were those executives who put employees' health and safety at the forefront, and they demonstrated empathy, and they made personal connections to what was going on, telling stories about themselves and what they were experiencing or what their employees were experiencing, and really demonstrating empathy. I thought, and there was also some really interesting case studies of how to do that and also talk about your business in a way that didn't feel gross. So Stuart Butterfield had an incredibly effective 41 tweet inside look at a play-by-play of what happened to his company when the country went into lockdown. And he's the CEO of Slack, and many of you probably use Slack as your internal messaging tool to organize your projects and whatnot. And he used Twitter to first acknowledge his employees. He talked about being a human first and being very worried about his employees and his customers and what was happening to everyone out there in the world. And then he gave this kind of hour by hour look that was fascinating. It gave real insight into how Slack, a company whose business skyrocketed during COVID, had to adapt to manage the massive demand. And it was incredibly fascinating about the business, but he also ended the 41st tweet in the thread was, if you're on the front lines fighting COVID-19, we will do anything we can. Use it for free, ask us for advice, email us at this address. We are profoundly grateful for all you are doing. So the communications felt authentic. And because he was transparent about some of the difficulties Slack faced in ramping up to meet demand so quickly, it didn't feel like overt capitalization. It felt like, wow, I'm getting an inside look at how this company has had to adapt, has made hard decisions, and has put people first. It felt like human-centered leadership. And I think that Twitter thread, which was covered by the media all over the place, was an incredibly powerful way to showcase that the brand did care about its employees and customers, and that even if there were glitches, it was a way to get ahead of those and create some empathy from a customer base who might have been slightly frustrated with, trying to get new Slack accounts or whatever it was. So incredibly authentic communications played a key role in positioning Slack in the right way, even as they met those challenges. And I thought that was a great example. On the other hand, when the Black Lives Matter protests happened, there were a lot of very uncomfortable executives who, especially in tech and especially in Silicon Valley, while employees and stakeholders were demanding action, they wanted to know what their leadership was going to do. Execs looked at their own diversity numbers and thought, we don't know how to weigh in here. Without looking inauthentic and without exploiting something or unearthing something that's actually very uncomfortable that we don't want the rest of the world to know, which is we don't employ enough Black people, if any, in some cases. And they were right. That was an incredibly tricky communications challenge for executives who were not already engaged on those issues and who were not able to back up what their action had been in the past to support those issues. So we saw some internal communications that fell very flat. There was, I saw multiple examples of executives trying to communicate internally to executives. They were doing things like throwing a Maya Angelou quote into an internal email and calling it a day. It didn't land well. Employees didn't like it. And they're probably suffering the consequences of that from an employee retention standpoint, or at least an employee satisfaction standpoint. So, much of when those communications fell flat had to do with, number one, their cultural values did not align to those communications. And that is absolutely critical in coming off as authentic. And two, because it was an issue that it was the first time that many executives had ever felt pressure to address, and it was this big issue about systemic racism and social justice, and even diversity and inclusion. Maybe some of these execs had never weighed in on those issues. It was really hard to show up in an authentic way. So to show up in an authentic way is critical. We have to align our values and have to admit when we haven't lived up to our own values or haven't done enough. Take the 23andMe CEO, that's Anne Wojcicki. She penned an internal memo, also posted to the 23andMe website, which was then covered by CNBC. And she also did a live interview on CNBC, where she admitted being part of the problem around diversity and inclusion, around social injustice, when it came to the lack of diversity in technology. And she vowed to do better. So admitting that the company hadn't done enough allowed her to enter that conversation in an authentic place and to position her company as one that does care and is going to take action to do better. We saw many examples of brands that had to shift perception in the moment, and those that did it right, their executives started those conversations in the right place. So they were open and transparent about what needed to change, and they were willing to deal with the fallout from those customers or partners or employees who had never heard them talk about that before and maybe didn't necessarily agree or align. So some of the more interesting examples we found, companies like Come and Go, the convenience store, never had weighed into an issue like this, as far as we knew. And how they got into that conversation was their executive said that acknowledging that Black Lives Matter is only the beginning for them. It was a great place for them to enter the conversation. It set them up for, we may not have all the answers today, but we're going to do more. Nascar was incredibly interesting this year, banning the Confederate flag at NASCAR events following the protests of Black Lives Matter protests and the murder of George Floyd, knowing full well that wasn't going to sit well with a good portion of their base, some significant portion of their base, and deciding that this was going to be the values of the new NASCAR going forward, and they were going to stick to that. There are moments where issues have forced us to change what is going to be authentic to our brand, and when we seize that moment in the right way, when our leaders demonstrate that they are willing to stand by those values, that can be incredibly powerful for a brand and for a company. And what they said is, who they'll lose, who they might lose as a result of that decision, they'll make up for it in new NASCAR fans that might not have considered NASCAR before. So so many examples like this. What's common here is that there are new expectations on our executives, not just to speak up, but to actually take a stand on some of these issues, knowing full well that there could be consequences to that, but knowing too that the opportunity will outweigh those consequences in the end. And the media is taking note of that authenticity. They recognize when a company speaks up and follows through or doesn't. They're checking back in. If you've said one thing, are you living those values within your company? They're looking at internal memos, and that's another shift that we're seeing. So what you communicate to employees internally is now also external, because a lot of the media, we can go to the next slide, Sarah, a lot of the media is reporting on those internal communications that executives are sending to their employees. We saw tons of examples of that, both positively affecting companies. The 23andMe CEO, her memo, ends up on CNBC and is covered widely, but she's ready for that and position the company in a good way off of that. You saw Google internal emails leaked to show, how execs were prepping employees for their coronavirus response. Then you saw this go very badly for some CEOs whose values weren't aligned to what their base or their employees' values were. The CrossFit CEO, Greg Olson, man, there couldn't have been a better example over 2020 of how to mess up in every possible way. He made light of both the coronavirus pandemic and the killing of George Floyd on Twitter, and then spoke belligerently to CrossFit gym owners about race and racism in a Zoom call that was also leaked to reporters. So of all the ways to do internal comms poorly, this was our poster child last year. So went badly for him. He ended up stepping down. And we have to know that what our executive leaders say, it has to be true. It has to be authentic to your values, and it has to be communicated consistently, no matter who your audience, whether you're talking to your employees internally or talking externally.
So as hard as all that is, it's not even enough. You can say the most beautiful, true, and authentic thing, but if you don't back it up with what you're actually doing, it's not enough. You get called out for that. That is how miney this minefield is. Words are not enough, and there needs to be actual change. And if you're not going to step into actual action and change, it might be a situation where remaining silent, as suspect as that can be, is a better move for your company. The issue is the stuff that's gone down this year is scary, scary stuff. It is death, it is injustice, it is economic devastation. When you have employees that are worried that when they leave the house to go to work, they're putting their lives at risk and their families' lives at risk, you need to show up strongly for them. Looking at Delta here, they were the first airline to come out and issue masks across all their flights before any government entities were doing that, and before any other airline certainly was doing that. They got a lot of pushback for that as masking became very politicized this year. But they were very clear and consistent. We're asking our employees to show up to work and put themselves at risk. We will make sure we do everything they can to be protected. We are asking our customers to continue to fly with us. We will do everything we can to make sure they were protected. So they came out really strong, and really in the end, it's shown them as like caring about their customers and their employees in a way that other airlines, miss the mark on. Looking at example after example with George Floyd, companies that even had stood up, that had great diversity numbers, that had stood up in the past in diversity and inclusion, if they came out and said something, no matter we support Black people, we need to do more, without saying what that more was, everyone was upset with them. Their own employees said, okay, what are you going to do about it? Put your money, put your power where your mouth is. Target came out very quickly. They had a facility that was at the site of the original protests that had damage done, quickly came out and said, we are going to build back. We are here. Our employees are safe. We did some crisis comms around that. But then within that week came out and said, we're donating $10 million to social justice here in the Twin Cities. Not only that, that same statement said, we are also going to announce a more integrated plan for how we're going to improve our own business. This is the date we will do that. And then we will follow up at these timelines with what we were going to be doing next. So like very clear communications. And people are willing to be patient with companies. Sephora just announced their action plan for racial bias, this month, 6 months later. And that's okay, as long as you are considered and you're telling people when it's coming and they know what to expect from you. I think what we saw with the response to the riot, obviously democracy being at stake and an unstable government is a problem for any business that operates in America in any capacity. So that was clear that that was an issue where almost any company could weigh in. But we also saw that, businesses have gained some experience this year. They recognize that the bar has risen in terms of speaking out and providing quick action as to what you're going to do about it, putting pressure on the government officials. So we saw a quicker reaction and we saw more action included immediately with communications there. And that really comes down to that enforcing your values consistency. A lot of companies didn't know what they could do action wise because they didn't know what their policies were. They didn't know if everyone knew what their policies were. Had they been communicated consistently? Did everyone who works at that company understand what is acceptable or not acceptable as an employee of that company? If they have board members calling them saying, we saw the manager of this facility was at the riots, what are you doing about it? If you don't know what your policies are and how they relate to your values as a company, you're gonna have a really hard time making that choice. IBM has never contributed to political campaigns. That put them in a great spot because they got a lot of coverage for that, which has been a policy for them for a long, long time. But we saw a lot of companies pivot and decide this was the time they were going to pivot. This is when we're going to pull ourselves back from this because we don't want to be in this position again, and start to clearly communicate that. You had companies like Hallmark, which is not known, that's a Kansas City-based company, not known as an activist company, immediately reach out to their state representatives in federal government who had voted to not approve the Electoral College and asked for their donations back. That's strong action. And that is what people are expecting. And that is getting a lot of coverage at this point.
So then we get to accountability, which is the round of all the authenticity and the action, right? You do the action, and was that action authentic to the business, and how are you actually tracking against what it is you said? Accountability, it can be kind of scary, right? Because there's that element of admitting wrongdoing if you miss that mark, and having to admit when there was failure or where there was areas that you could have performed a bit better. But there's also that opportunity in recognizing that human element and owning your mistakes and being more real. And there's that level of transparency that all the audiences are looking for from their executives and the businesses. And the real value of accountability has to come from the executive and internally from the business before it comes from the media and the public. Otherwise, it's just a reaction to trying to be held more accountable and the lack of transparency. And this came through a lot in the last year and a half. One of the ways that we saw this was with Snap. So up until even as recently as June, the Snap CEO, there's that lack of transparency. There's been a demand for that, the diversity numbers and reports. How is the company doing? Where does it ranking when it comes to the hiring and promotion of Black people, minorities within the organization? And it was always a kind of a slough off and tried making a stance of we're not going to release diversity numbers. It's not something that we think motivates other people. Imagine is we're about at where the rest of the tech companies are, which isn't great. And so with those statements as recent as June, even after everything going on with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's murder, it got a lot of attention around for those comments and that lack of transparency to held the company accountable. And so then the company came out in July releasing that diversity numbers, realizing that importance of having something to help hold that company accountable too. Again, similar like what I said too with silence a suspect, it's a full picture, right? Media wants to help hold you accountable, but your customers and your employees want to know, what are you doing? How are we tracking? We made this huge promise last year. What improvements have we made in trying to reach that goal? And so especially looking forward at 2021 and exec comp plans, looking at, okay, when are we going to be meeting what we've said we were going to say last year? How are we going to help hold ourselves accountable? May's the anniversary, 1 year since George Floyd's murder. A lot of companies, as we've seen, have come out and said they're going to be putting millions of dollars into DE&I efforts. We're going to focus, or COVID, we're going to focus on implementing new safety protocols and how we're going to keep our employees safe. What progress has been made now, a year since that has happened? What did you actually do what you said you were going to do? We've seen this already, companies making those strides. Most recently, I'd say Apple announcing the first investments from the fund that they announced last year, devoted to HBCUs, Detroit Innovation Center. And so being able to kind of map those out and help hold our companies accountable, especially as comms professionals, we're kind of that first line of holding that C-suite accountable, being, what did we say? Where are we at? And if we realize, you know what, we didn't actually make strides there, being ready and having that prep to be, you know what, real, as we didn't make it as far as we want to, and being able to articulate then what changes and actions are you going to do then to improve this time, help push yourself forward. So it can be, again, a little scary in that, like, admitting you're wrong, but if you're really committed to making that difference and coming from that place, again, of authenticity and actually putting action there is that opportunity to be able to be that company and that leadership as well. On that flip side, as too, for accountability, we've seen happen a lot more recently. Business leaders and leaders are being held accountable for their associations from all different degrees, the whole view. In the press, we saw this in New York Times newsletter. What about the enablers? In the newsletter, it said, at a time when business leaders tout their values and social responsibility, how should those enablers and the institutions they run be considered after this? And that's in response to the Capitol riots and the violence that happened within DC in the wake of the election and claims of voter fraud. The article notes as an example, Larry Ellison and Zephyr Katz of Oracle and their vocal support of Trump and Trump's then association with the insurrection in DC, and asking, you know, what is kind of the, I don't want to keep using accountability, but how are we holding these companies accountable for the support that they played in what happened in DC on the 6th? So we had reporters reaching out asking, do clients run on Oracle? Are executives reconsidering their association with Oracle, and questions like that? And while that's just one example, it comes in a lot of different ways. Again, we also saw it with Parler, and are they a customer of all these different, are they a customer of the cloud providers? How are you deciding what customers you're supporting? And so an audit of all those potential associations. Who are your employees, your customers, your partners? Even looking, as Sarah said, where's your money going? What political organizations is the company supporting, and do all of these map back to the values you claim to have as a company and the actions that you've put forward and the strides that you're trying to make for the future, and does that map back into that? These are the kind of questions that reporters are asking. And again, employees and your audience, and your wider audience, wants to know what type of investment and what type of view and what type of work that you're doing to help hold yourself accountable from all views.
So hopefully just hearing all of those folks who did it real bad or quite good, considering, you've gotten some ideas of how you might yourself prepare your company, your C-suite team to do better this year. We don't know what's going to come next. We've stopped trying to guess. We don't even want to talk about it because it feels like we're going to ask for it. But there are ways to plan for the unpredictable, and that's our jobs. That's the job we signed up for. So we're going to dig into that a bit here. This needs to be, we now approach executive communications like a crisis communications plan. And that requires a full audit of what are our values? Are we communicating those values? Does everyone in this company understand them? Do they touch deeply into how that executive speaks and runs the company? Do we have policies that align to those values? Are those clearly communicated and shared again and again and again? Have we stretched that across our associations, our supply chain, our political donations, all of our vendor relationships? Is that clear? have we identified all the folks that would be involved in our crisis response? Because I think this is really something that caught people unawares this year. Are our internal comms and external comms teams aligned? Is there enough crossover there? Do we stretch deep enough into our operational teams, those folks that are on the ground, so that do they understand all these values and policies and know to come to us when something comes up? So those processes and teams need to be identified, and that is something that can be done no matter the situation, no matter the potential crisis that comes up. The other key part of this that not enough companies do, and that we often do, is one of the first things we do with clients, is really understand those C-suite's personal connections. What do they care about personally and passionately? What is a value that they've held throughout their leadership journey and career? What are some examples they can speak to? What are those things that feel most authentic and true to them? We have a lot of companies where the CEO is not the person in some of these times, and that's okay. They don't have to be. It might be your CTO, it might be your chief people officer, it might be someone else. That's okay. Look at the bench, see where their passions are, where their expertise is. Are they the best at being authentic, or are they authentically not great at talking to people? That's fine, as long as we recognize it and plan for it. That helps you activate your 3 A's. And then when you're actually in the moment, that change in the media with how they're getting their stories, that change in your employees becoming sources by just either saying how great you did or how disappointed they were in you, means that for executive communications, these channels all matter intensely. You have to think about your internal memos. You have to think about your blog. If you are testing something out, if you've pivoted and you're trying something new, start with the internal stuff, get it right, do contributed content where you have control over the entire message before you go out and put them on stage or a virtual stage, whatever it might be, to speak about that publicly. Use your social media to listen before you start pushing out. So really thinking across channel in this is crucial, because your audience is already doing that. So if you're not, it's time to catch up.
And so when we look at how we leverage what we've learned in 2020 moving forward and using all those 3 A's, if you walk away kind of with that one recap of what it looks like to apply it, first you have to be authentic. Look at your values. Look, is it clear from your policies? You have to speak about them before the crisis and live them before you need it. It's almost right like that bank type reservoir. You have to put in the money, you have to speak to it before you can withdraw it and use that back.
Every communications plan needs an action plan. Again, that might mean you have someone from finance who is part of your crisis response team. If you got to put money someplace, that person needs to be involved ASAP. So every time you talk about what you're going to say, you need to make sure you're talking about what you can do, and it needs to be true. And even if you say, I'll tell you later, that works, but you got to tell them when you're going to tell them.
And finally, hold yourself accountable. Make commitments that you can follow through on. Be proactive in the way you're communicating your progress. That's incredibly important. And make sure that that you're willing to admit when you haven't made the progress that you wanted to. You've done that in a proactive way before the media comes looking, or before employees are calling you out. All those things are going to help bolster our executive communications going into 2021. If you ever have questions about those things, you know where to find us. We're at Hotwire. We have about 11 minutes left to answer any questions that you might have. You can submit those through the Q&A. We already have a few coming in. And please feel free, of course, if you have additional questions, if we don't get to all of them today, we'll follow up with you individually. Always feel free to reach out if you have questions about executive communications planning, about narrative development, about high stakes media and presentation coaching, or other communications needs. Feel free to reach out to me personally, and we can get you some advice and direction there. So we'll move very quickly to questions. Again, we have about 11 minutes, and we've got a couple here in the chat. One from Maria Barnes. Do you see the trends of how CEOs in different countries are expected to react to the changes occurring in communities? For example, just yesterday, I read an article that McKinsey in the US was expected to express their opinion on societal problems, including movements and protests, while in Eastern Europe, McKinsey issued an internal memo banning employees from participating in different protests and expressing their opinions. So this is a really interesting example that you've given us. I mean, certainly we're seeing an unprecedented level of executives weighing in globally on issues that have arisen in America, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement and the Capitol riots. I've never seen more engagement from executives outside of the U.S. engaging on issues that look like they are pretty centered in U.S. culture. That's a shift, and I think that will continue because now the dam's been broken. And this is another thing where McKinsey is talking out one side of their mouth and not the other. And I think that it's really clear if you're going to have different policies in different countries that you address that there are those discrepancies, because what they're finding is, an internal memo is leaking when what we're saying publicly is something different. That can look very misaligned, and it's okay to acknowledge, not every country might have the same rules when it comes to communications, but it's going to be really important to be proactive and transparent about the different rules in the different countries, lest people call you out. So it's a great question.
I would just add to that one thing, two things. With COVID, some of the best responses we saw were from totally global international companies. Siemens came out and did a deep dive into how they were changing their work from home policies and shifting everything internally to make things work better for their employees globally, and how that's a long-term shift and they're not coming back. We also saw a lot of interesting transition from Asia being shut down and all the lessons learned that were transferred across the globe, either from a global corporation who took their teams in Asia, led the way, when they had to send engineers home and had to get them safe and secure and stable internet connections, to how they shifted production globally. So I think with global, truly global issues, you are going to see higher expectation across the globe. And I know we've ended up training our teams globally on some of the Black Lives Matters issues, so they can, because that's a global civil rights issue that we're seeing take off, and our teams are advising their clients globally as well.
Yep. Great point, Sarah. We have another question. How do you advise a new company working on articulating our values to communicate and speak up on current issues? And I always like a good framework for these things so that we're not just like, oh, is it now? Do we weigh in now? Do we weigh in later? I like a good framework. And some of those, a pretty simple one to follow is, does this matter affect my employees and stakeholders? Is this going to be of importance? When it came to COVID, the answer was yes for everyone. When it came to Black Lives Matter, it was yes for almost everyone, I would say. When it came to the riots, that's a little bit different. Did I have employees involved? That I need to take action, regarding, or had we made political contributions to someone that, was involved in one way or another? You need to look at our association. So if it's a matter that affects my employees or stakeholders, the answer is yes. We can look at what the most appropriate response is, whether that's internal or external, knowing internal becomes external now. Am I associated in some more direct way? And that, like Charlene talked about, that the degrees of separation have broadened over the last year. So it used to be, if my company isn't directly involved, I'm probably okay. Now it's, do I host two-factor authentication for Parler? That was one that came out. Twilio cut off two-factor authentication for Parler. It was probably a small piece of business for Twilio and a pretty small connection, but they were still willing to come out and say, we don't want to be associated with this. That aligns to our values, and we're okay to say we're going to take a stand on this issue. So to get that buy-in from your executives, to help them understand when it's time to speak up, a simple framework can always be really useful. Does it affect us? Are we associated in some way? Does it align to our values? If all those two of the three are right, it's time to say something. Okay, we've got another question. Sarah, you ready? Charlene, are you ready? It says, those audits, plans, policies, and internal processes will take time and require internal stakeholders to drive them with a level of robustness and candor. This is from one of our colleagues in the UK. While that process is happening, things will change. Stories will drop and the media will be thirsty for responses, as we've discussed. So, should you plan to react to media questions or being proactive about publicizing viewpoints externally? Be proactive. If we suggest the latter, how do you avoid being typecast as ambulance chasing when commenting on an issue outside of your brand's wheelhouse? It's a great question. Sarah, you're nodding. I'll let you go first, then I'll add in.
I think that is complex. And I think some of the scenarios we talked about answered it to a certain extent. Like if you're willing to come out and say, we are looking at this. This is something we're taking seriously. But if you don't have a very specific action plan aligned and you can't back that up and you can't be sure that your internal team will actually follow through with that, then no, then I wouldn't speak to those issues. But if you're truly using this as a moment to pivot, responding to those media inquiries actually helps you do that. It helps you get that message out to all of those stakeholders that might care. And also will hold those folks internally accountable. Once it's in the news, then they're accountable. And that's also something that's been helpful about these internal comms going external is it's provided that layer of accountability. And we have seen the media taking people to task on this. So that accountability will be coming from external forces more so than it ever has. And that's like a local media. I saw a local news story here in the Twin Cities that asked, what are all the professional sports teams that promised to donate all this money? Where's it actually gone? So it's not just even at the national level, it's in communities. People want to know what's next. So I would say, if you need that pressure, and if you're sure that with that pressure, your team internally will follow through, then yes, that helps support the mission and the change that needs to happen.
Awesome. And you're touching on the other question I see from Mike Janes. It says, no matter how well an exec and his or her organization may be doing on these issues, upholding their values, being proactive, being accountable, they'll always get criticism from some stakeholders. I think Sarah made this point, it says. So how do you ignore the sometimes unfair criticism, particularly when it's loud on social media, and press on without feeling defeated? I think it's such a great question. And, one thing we've certainly recognized over the past year is that, and we keep talking about it, as we have to be able to live with the consequences. And the best way to live with the consequences is feel very solid in the recommendations and actions that we're taking. And the better that we align those with our values, the better we're able to say, you know what? I hear you. I hear that. I know that this isn't going to make everyone happy, or that there will be people who disagree, but this is true to us. This is who we want to be as a company. This is what we think matters to people and will make the world better and safer, and make our brand more allow us to attract the talent and the types of people that we want to attract here. And so we're okay with it. And we know it's sometimes the best release, Mike, is to say, we know that this isn't going to be, go down well with everybody that engages with us. We know that that's true. And we understand that, and we're willing to live with it because we believe that this is the right direction for us. So sometimes it's in acknowledging. Brands get really afraid to acknowledge that, oh my gosh, there might be dissent, when actually it can be the best way to diffuse what is sometimes, the Twitter storm that may come, I'll say. There's one more question here. What is your recommendation if we're working with a reluctant or play it safe executive? What have you seen change their mind that they need to get vocal? I'll go back to the framework, which is, are employees and customers affected? That's a red flag that we may need to say something. Two, are we associated, and might our brand be associated with this in some way? Also a red flag where you want to be proactive about those communications. And then something that Charlene and Sarah and I do a lot is we do pretty regular media audits where we look at, who's out there talking about what, who has shown up well, what has worked, where has top tier coverage positioned the company in a positive way versus not. And sometimes showing those examples to executives who are reluctant, where we say, look, here's another, we work with a lot of engineering-led orgs, we work with a lot of operational CEOs, and we say, look, here's another person like you with a similar size and scale of company in a similar space who's been out there and with this comments here has been the result for their brand. And so showing them examples of what that might look like and lead to can often be, the best way to put a reluctant executive forward or to convince them that it's time to say something. To Sarah's point, we are the first to say, this isn't the right person to do that. And that requires a bravery of communications professionals. You have to be brave sometimes to say, you know what, this message isn't going to sound right coming from you. And we've got someone better. We've got a president. We've got your chief people officer who's going to be able to deliver this in a way that's really going to resonate with our employees or our customers. And we want to use them first.
The only thing I would add to that is most of these situations have absolutely required internal communications. And most CEOs recognize that leadership among their employee base and their team is a requirement, and they don't have a choice there. And that is both a way to get them comfortable with the messages that might be messages they're not used to sharing, and also understanding that this could end up going wider helps them understand that, a toe in some ways there.
That's right. I see one more question, but we're at time. It's a really good question, but it's an anonymous attendee. So if you will email me and let me know who you are, Sarah, Charlene, and I will respond to your question because I'd really like to answer that one. Thank you so much for joining us. We've appreciated you spending time with us. We are here for you if you ever have questions or need advice or direction or want to run something by us. And we hope to see you next time. Thanks, everyone.